The air in King's Landing was thick with tension, the scent of burning wood and oil hanging over the Red Keep like an unspoken threat. The city was under siege, Robert Baratheon's forces closing in from the east, while Tywin Lannister's army had marched under the pretense of loyalty, waiting for the right moment to strike. Within the throne room, King Aerys II paced frantically, his once golden Targaryen hair now thin and unkempt, his violet eyes bloodshot with paranoia. His fingernails were black with dried blood, as he had taken to scratching at his own skin whenever a dark thought clouded his mind. His lips trembled as he turned to his most trusted pyromancer. "Burn them all," he whispered, then louder. "Burn them all!" The pyromancers had spent years preparing for this moment. Wildfire, a substance that burned even on water, had been carefully hidden beneath the streets of King's Landing. With a single command, the city would be engulfed in flames, turning Robert Baratheon's victory into a Pyrrhic one. Sir Jaime Lannister stood beside the Iron Throne, clad in his white Kingsguard armor, his sword resting at his side. He had heard the king's orders, he had seen the madness in his eyes. This was the moment that would define his life. But this time something held him back. Perhaps it was fear, or perhaps it was the weight of duty drilled into him by his father. He did not draw his sword, he did not strike down the king, he merely stood there, frozen, as Aerys gave the order. The pyromancers hurried out of the throne room. The orders spread like wildfire. Soon the city would match the flames that had consumed Aerys's mind. And then the first explosion shook the earth. A great column of green fire erupted from beneath Fleabottom, tearing through wooden homes and engulfing screaming citizens in an instant. The wildfire spread rapidly, consuming entire districts. People ran for their lives, but there was nowhere to go. The walls of King's Landing trapped them inside their own funeral pyre. Jaime turned to see the king laughing, his voice shrill, his body trembling with excitement. "This is my city!" Aerys shrieked. "They will not take it from me!" Jaime's stomach twisted. He had failed. His inaction had doomed thousands. Outside the city walls, Robert Baratheon and Ned Stark stood in stunned silence as the skyline of King's Landing became a wall of green flame. The screams of the dying could be heard even from miles away. Tywin Lannister, leading his forces toward the city gates, stopped in horror. He had planned to betray Aerys and claim the capital for his family, but now there was nothing left to take. The Golden Lion had arrived too late. Within the Red Keep, Princess Rhaella clutched young Viserys to her chest. The queen had been preparing to flee, but the fire had spread faster than anyone expected. The ships meant to take her and her son away were already burning in the bay. Far to the west, Rhaegar Targaryen lay dying on the banks of the Trident, his lifeblood spilling into the river as he looked up at the sky. Did he know? Could he see the fire that had swallowed his home? As the flames crept toward the Red Keep, Jaime turned his eyes to the king one last time, and the Mad King smiled. Smoke filled the corridors of the Red Keep, thick and choking. The screams of burning men, women, and children outside the walls created an eerie chorus of suffering. The wildfire had spread faster than even Aerys had anticipated, leaping from district to district, consuming homes, markets, and even the Sept of Baelor in its merciless hunger. Jaime Lannister stumbled back as a section of the ceiling collapsed near the throne room entrance, sending embers and stones scattering across the floor. He coughed violently, his eyes burning, his mind racing. The Mad King had done it! He had destroyed his own city! Jimmy turned to Aerys, expecting to see fear in his eyes, but the old king was grinning, basking in the destruction he had unleashed. "This is my legacy!" Aerys cried, arms outstretched. "Let them remember the dragon's wrath!" The words made Jaime's blood run cold. This wasn't a man. This was something worse, a creature driven by madness, by hate, by the desire to see. Everything perished before his own death. From the corridor outside, panicked footsteps echoed. A group of royal guards rushed in, their white cloaks stained with soot and blood. Among them was Sir Barristan Selmy, his face grim. "My king," Barristan said urgently, barely sparing a glance at Jaime. "The Red Keep won't hold much longer." "We must flee." "Flee?" Aerys cackled. "Where would a dragon flee? I am the fire, I am—" The doors burst open again, and in stormed Tywin Lannister, his golden armor streaked with dirt, his crimson cloak dragging across the soot-covered floor. Behind him, Lannister soldiers poured in, swords drawn, their expressions unreadable. Jaime felt the shift in the room immediately. The power had changed hands. Tywin was not here to rescue Aerys. He was here to take the throne for himself. Aerys, for the first time, showed a flicker of doubt. His wild eyes darted around the room, landing on Jaime. "You," he whispered, "you swore an oath." Jaime's breath caught in his throat. "You swore to protect me," the king howled. Jaime didn't respond. He couldn't. His father was here. The man who had shaped his life, who had instilled in him a sense of duty, of power, of control. And in that moment, Jaime realized something terrible. He had already chosen his path. He had let Aerys live. And now Tywin Lannister would decide the fate of the realm. Tywin took slow, deliberate steps toward the throne, his eyes cold. "Your Grace," he said, his voice like steel, "the city is lost." Aerys's hands trembled, but his pride refused to let him kneel. "You betrayed me." Tywin smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You betrayed yourself." A tense silence followed. The only sound was the crackling of fire from the broken windows, the distant screams of the dying. Then, in a move faster than anyone expected, Aerys lunged toward one of the fallen guards and grabbed a dagger. With a shriek of rage, he charged at Tywin. The Lannister lord did not flinch. Sir Gregor Clegane moved first. The Mountain intercepted the Mad King with brutal efficiency, his massive hand wrapping around Aerys's throat, lifting him off the ground. The dagger clattered to the floor. Aerys kicked and screamed, but his frail body was no match for Gregor's monstrous strength. "No!" Jaime stepped forward, but it was too late. Gregor squeezed. A sickening crunch echoed through the hall. The Mad King's body went limp. His eyes, once filled with fire, dimmed into empty pools. Gregor tossed him aside like a broken doll, his corpse slumping against the foot of the Iron Throne. Jaime could only stare. It was over. The man he had sworn to protect was dead, but not by his hand, and as he turned to look at his father, he saw no sadness, no regret, only calculation. Tywin Lannister had won. The Mad King's corpse lay slumped against the Iron Throne, his violet eyes wide open in death, his thin lips curled in a final, silent scream. The great fire he had unleashed upon his own city still raged beyond the walls of the Red Keep, but inside the true battle had already been decided. Jaime Lannister stood frozen, his heart pounding as he stared at his father. Tywin's face was unreadable, his golden eyes reflecting the flickering flames that seeped through the shattered stained glass windows. The moment that should have belonged to Jaime, the moment that should have made him a kingslayer, was stolen. Instead, it was Sir Gregor Clegane, the Mountain, who had crushed the last Targaryen king with his bare hands, and Tywin had watched, silent, knowing this was the only way. Jaime clenched his fists, but he said nothing. Sir Barristan Selmy, still, kneeling from where he had attempted to intervene, let out a slow breath. His honor-bound instincts had demanded he protect the king, but the moment had passed. The realm had changed hands in an instant, and Barristan, for all his skill, could do nothing to change that. The Lannister soldiers stood still, waiting for orders. They had expected bloodshed, but the scene before them was something else, a coup without war drums, a throne taken in silence. Tywin stepped forward, his heavy crimson cloak dragging along the stone floor, and looked down at the lifeless body of Aerys too. "Get rid of it," he said flatly. The words broke whatever spell had been holding the room in place. Gregor Clegane grabbed the dead king by the arm and dragged him away like a sack of flour, his massive steps echoing down the corridor. Jaime's stomach twisted at the sight. Aerys may have been mad, but he had been a king. His end deserved more than this. But this was Tywin Lannister's way. No ceremony, no honor, just results. Beyond the throne room, the castle was in chaos. Flames had spread dangerously close to the royal chambers, and the thick black smoke had begun to fill the hallways. Servants ran in every direction, some coughing, others dragging whatever valuables they could carry before fleeing into the night. But not all could run. In a hidden chamber, deep within Maegor's holdfast, Queen Rhaella held her young son Viserys close to her chest. The boy, only 8, was shaking, his silver-gold hair damp with sweat. "We have to go," whispered Sir Willem Darry, one of the few remaining loyalists of House Targaryen. He stood at the chamber door, his sword drawn, listening for approaching footsteps. The city is lost. Rhaella's heart pounded. The Targaryen dynasty had ruled for nearly 300 years. And now, in the span of a single night, it had been torn apart. Her eldest son, Rhaegar, was dead on the Trident. Her husband, the king, was almost certainly dead as well, and her unborn child stirred inside her, oblivious to the world burning around. "Them? Where will we go?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Dragonstone," Sir Willem said. "For now." It wasn't much of a plan, but it was all they had. Outside the chamber, the sound of armored boots grew louder. A group of Lannister soldiers marched past, laughing, boasting about how easily they had taken the keep. One of them spoke louder than the rest. "Lord Tywin wants the boy found." Viserys let out a quiet whimper, pressing himself closer to his mother. Rhaella's breath caught in her throat. She had no doubt what Tywin Lannister wanted. The only reason House Lannister had spared any members of House Targaryen in the past was for political advantage. But now with Robert Baratheon at their back, there was no need for mercy. Sir Willem cursed under his breath. They had to leave. Now! He grabbed a heavy cloak from the nearby chest and threw it over Viserys, covering his silver hair. "Come," he whispered. "We must not be seen." As the Queen and her son slipped into the hidden tunnels beneath the Red Keep, the last remnants of House Targaryen disappeared into the night. Back in the throne room, Tywin stood before the Iron Throne, his hands folded behind his back. The fire outside the castle continued to burn, but it no longer mattered. He had won, or had he? Jaime watched him carefully, waiting for what would come next. Tywin had orchestrated this moment for years, maneuvering himself into a position where he could control the future of the realm, but the Iron Throne was empty, and Tywin, for all his victories, would never sit upon it. A new king had to be chosen. The great doors opened again, and a new set of footsteps echoed through the hall. Eddard Stark and Robert Baratheon had arrived. Robert, covered in dust and dried blood, from the battle at the Trident, stormed forward, his massive warhammer still in hand. His blue eyes scanned the room before landing on the corpse of the Mad King, already gone, leaving only a dark smear of blood against the stone. He let out a breath, half relief, half disappointment. "So it's done," he muttered. Tywin turned, to face him, his face betraying nothing. "King's Landing is yours." Robert frowned, glancing at the destruction outside. "Some King's Landing." Ned Stark, standing beside him, remained silent, his gaze shifting between Jaime and the empty throne. The Warden of the North had no love for the Lannisters, and this scene reeked of treachery. But what could he do? The city was lost. The war was over, and Robert Baratheon would sit the throne. It was inevitable. Tywin stepped forward. "My men have secured the keep. The Targaryens are finished," Robert scoffed. Good. His hatred for the dragon-blooded rulers was no secret. But then his gaze darkened. "Where's the girl?" Tywin's expression didn't change. Robert meant Elia Martell, Rhaegar's wife, the woman who had once been princess of this very castle. Jaime already knew the answer. Gregor Clegane had been sent to the royal chambers before they had reached the throne room. "And the mountain did not take prisoners." Ned Stark tensed. "You butchered them, didn't you?" he asked, his voice low. Tywin gave him a long, unreadable look. "The war is over," the Lannister lord said instead. Ned turned away, jaw clenched. Robert didn't press further. He didn't care. To him, the death of Rhaegar's wife and children was a necessary evil. The war had cost him too much already. Lyanna was gone. That was all that mattered to him. Jaime watched in silence. He knew that whatever happened next, he would never be remembered as a hero. No one would ever know what had nearly happened, that he had almost done the right thing, and in the end it hadn't mattered. Tywin Lannister had won, and the realm would never be the same again. The Iron Throne loomed over them all, its jagged steel forged from the weapons of 1,000 fallen men. It was a seat of power, but also a seat of suffering. The Mad King had burned an entire city rather than let it fall to his enemies, and now his corpse was already forgotten, dragged into the darkness like common filth. Jaime Lannister watched from the side of the room, his white cloak stained with ash, as Robert Baratheon placed one boot on the first step, leading to the throne. The great warrior, the rebel who had slain Prince Rhaegar on the Trident, now stood before the ultimate prize. For a moment, he hesitated. Robert was a man made for war, not for ruling. His massive shoulders sagged under the weight of expectation. He had won, but at what cost? Lyanna Stark was dead. The city he was supposed to rule was a smouldering ruin. The Targaryens had been wiped from power, but the realm was in chaos. Tywin Lannister stepped forward, always the master of the moment. "Your Grace," he said smoothly, already addressing Robert as king. "Westeros needs stability. The war is over. It is time for peace." Robert exhaled sharply, his grip tightening on his warhammer. He turned, looking at his friend, Eddard Stark. "What do you think, Ned?" Ned's face was grim. His eyes drifted to the throne, then to the bodies, still being dragged from the halls. He had seen too much death in these past years, his father, his brother, his men who had died for this cause. And now, an entire city burned for a war they had already won. "The realm needs a king," he said at last. Robert looked back at the throne. He hated politics, but he could not abandon this now. Lyanna was gone. His war was over. He let out a tired laugh and shook his head. "Fine," he muttered. "I'll take the damn thing." The room was silent for a moment. Then Tywin Lannister smiled. The Lion had gotten exactly what he wanted. Far from the ruined capital, a single ship cut through the stormy waters of Blackwater Bay. The waves crashed against the hull, sending cold spray over the deck as the wind howled through the sails. Queen Rhaella sat huddled in her cabin, her arms wrapped tightly around her young son Viserys. The boy was pale, his silver-blonde hair damp from sweat and sea spray. His wide violet eyes stared out at nothing, his mind unable to comprehend the destruction of everything he had ever known. Sir Willem Darry knelt beside them, his sword still unsheathed. He had fought to get them out of the city, had killed to see them safely aboard this ship. But even now, even with the Red Keep burning behind them, he knew they were not truly safe. The Targaryen dynasty was over, the dragon had fallen, and yet as Rhaella pressed a hand to her stomach, she felt the faintest movement. A child, not yet born, her last hope. "We will go to Dragonstone," Sir Willem said quietly. "We will keep you safe, my queen." Rhaella closed her eyes. The gods had abandoned them. The realm had turned against them. But if there was any justice in this world, perhaps one day the dragons would rise again. Viserys's small fingers curled into fists. "They will pay for this," he whispered. Sir Willem looked at him, his heart heavy. The boy was too young to understand. But one day he would. One day he would remember. Back in King's Landing, the fires had begun to die, but the smell of death lingered in the air. Thousands had perished in the Mad King's final act of defiance. The streets were littered with charred bodies, the river choked with corpses. Jaime Lannister walked through the ruined capital in silence, his white cloak, the symbol of his Kingsguard oath, dragged behind him, heavy with the weight of failure. He had stood in the throne room and done nothing. He had let the Mad King burn his own city, and now thousands were dead because of it. No one called him a hero. No one even looked at him. To the people of King's Landing, he was just another knight who had failed to protect them. As he walked, he heard a voice behind him. "You should have done it." Jaime turned, his golden hair glinting in the faint light. Sir Barristan Selmy stood there, his face lined with sorrow. His once pristine armour was tarnished with soot, his expression one of quiet disappointment. Jaime said nothing. Barristan sighed. "You had the chance, boy. You could have ended it." Jaime clenched his jaw. "And what would that have changed?" Barristan met his gaze. "Everything." The older knight turned and walked away, leaving Jaime alone in the wreckage of the realm he had failed to save. For years to come, songs would be sung of Robert's victory, of the fall of the Targaryens, of the great war that had ended with fire and blood. But no one would sing of Jaime Lannister. No one would remember the knight who had hesitated. And so the Lion of Lannister walked on, a man without a name, a knight without honor, in a world that no longer had use for him. The war was over, but the scars it left would never heal.